So now, first of all, what considerations do we need to devote ourselves to initially when it comes to Russia? One of them being that Russia is one of the least explored, the least literalized, and in various other ways publicized huge countries, archipelago really in the world, and that just on that basis it requires some respect. The other way, because I'm being instigated in that regard, is that I have a very good friend who unfortunately lives a long ways away, and that is James Bubar, who years ago worked with me at the Philosophical Research Society, and who is an academic scholar of Russian literature and has done some very fine work along that line, but is living at the present time in Turkey. So every once in a while he gets a little bit too lonesome. Then he calls me, usually on a Saturday in the daytime, and we discuss philosophical and related matters. So he keeps my interest alive, because even though he lives in Izmir in Turkey, which is the ancient Smyrna, in the ancient times it was the Greek Smyrna. Even though he lives there, he has married a lady from Russia, from St. Petersburg, and he is, I think, running up a big credit with the Russian and Turkish Airlines, flying back and forth to St. Petersburg and to Izmir. So he's very much aware of what is happening at the present time, and he is also a very good esoteric scholar and just basically an occult student as well. So these keep my interest alive. However, if that is of any interest, and I will mention it just the same, a curious little sort of pseudo-psychic experiences in my life which have pointed to Russia. When I was a little child, not much more than, I don't know, 5, 6 years old or so, I liked to sketch, draw little pictures. So while I was doing that, I always got a sort of a smallish piece of paper, and then, as my mother explained to me over the years, I always drew some pictures that were very similar. It was always of a man in a very ornate, elaborate dress with many medals and decorations on it, and I think a little beard, and I would just turn them out in considerable volume. So then at one point my father, I think, said, that looks like a Tsar. And I said yes, as if in my great wisdom at that early age, I was qualified to say so. I said yes, and then my father said, well, what do you know about that? I said, well, I know that the Tsar his name was Nicholas, just like Saint Nicholas, the Santa Claus, and that he was a very holy man and a very great ruler. And my father said, well, you know, they killed him, because by then the Russian Revolution had occurred. And I was a little tyke, and I was absolutely horrified. My father said, I threw myself on the ground, and I said, but they can't do that, the Tsar is sacred. Well, I said, I wish they had listened to you, but they have done it. And so that's it. And so then I said, well, Tsar is somebody who looks like those weird little pictures that I drew, and is someone who had been killed. So my interest continued, and in many ways continued up to the present time. And let's say I have always been somehow naturally, just from the time that I was born, I had a tremendous interest in and reverence for Tsar Nicholas, which bears out to the present time. I have, I think, no less than three pictures, three icons of Tsar Nicholas and of the family, his wife and his children, in my quarters. And I, along with the worldwide Orthodox Church, I do regard him as a saint and a martyr. But that's only something of comparatively recent times. And then, of course, owing to the fact that my native land, Hungary, is reasonably close to Russia, maybe a little bit too close for comfort. We had in my childhood quite a lot of Russian exiles from the Tsar's time who had to flee the Soviet Union and who were now located in Hungary and also in Yugoslavia, which was very friendly to the Ancien regime in St. Petersburg because of the commonality of the Orthodox Church. And we had a part of our large house in the southern Yugoslav city of Subotica or Sabotka. We had it was rented out to a Yugoslav army officer and his family, very, very nice people. And there, once a year, there was always a big festival called the Svečar, which the Slavic Orthodox people hold, and that is the festival of the patron saint of the family. Family chooses a patron saint. I see a little saintly canine there. In any event, so we were the landlord, so we were inevitably invited to that. And one time that I remember, I must have been about 8 years old probably, we were invited to the officer's family for a Svečar, and the Orthodox priest, the father with the great big beard, they are very awesome looking people, was there. And I was introduced to him and we talked a little and so forth. And he did something that I think generally is considered not so terribly priestly, because he said, come on son, sit down here. I sat down more or less in his lap, and then he started reading my palm, which I say is not usually a a priestly activity, but certainly it was in the Serbian Orthodox Church there. And that was the first time that prophecy was made to me. He said, you are going to go very, very far away from here, where we were. But you are always going to be all right. Don't worry. You will be in great danger many times, but you will not succumb to the dangers, and the angels are looking out for you. So I said, well, thank you so much. So interestingly enough, that dovetailed with some other, maybe less voluminous prophecies. But let's say I always had a soft spot in my heart for the Orthodox Church with the beautiful rituals, the magnificent vestments, all gold and jeweled, and which we were frequently exposed to in the old Yugoslavia, because that, of course, was dominated by the Serbian nationality, who are all of the Orthodox faith, and I would just look out the window and see these magnificent processions with golden banners and bells and censers on the street, in Greek and in Serbian. It's absolutely wonderful. In any event, that was the beginning, because it was again a sort of link with the Orthodox Church. Now, to go on from there, let's say, obviously, under those circumstances, we had considerable contact with the exiled Russians of Tsar's Russia. And we would, my father and I would take almost daily sojourn in this is a small city, in the city every day, and then we would visit various people. And most of the people whom we were visited were exiled Russians, obviously of higher status before, but now having fallen on evil days. I remember one captain who he was selling newspapers and magazines. So father and I always walked over to him. My father always shook hands with him. And then we started talking, and he would tell us about old Russia and tell us how nice it was and so forth. And then there were others. There was a very beautiful Russian lady who came and taught me French, because in old Russia the language of the educated people was French. This has been held against the Tsar's Russia frequently, but nobody seems to keep in mind that what Tsar Nicholas and others were doing, they were trying to counteract the ever more rampant and pernicious nationalism which was growing in Europe by teaching people another language. And so when so many of the people spoke French, this has discouraged the Russian nationalism which was already growing, like the German nationalism of Hitler that was growing and all of that between the two wars. In any event, so let's see, my interest in Russia, and certainly not in the Soviet Union, but in old Russia, in what now has been, I think, aptly named under the present circumstances, Holy Russia has been greatly stimulated in those times. Now, going further with that theme, let's say the inquiry about what Russia really is, what it stands for, and that there is a Russia aside from the pernicious Soviet Union. This was an important element. So I was always interested in looking up the history of Russia and various information connected with that. So what I would like you to do at this time, if it's not too much trouble, to kind of visualize a map. And this map has a semicircle of pretty high mountains that starts in the north, circles around, and then goes clear down south to the Balkans. And these are the Carpathian Mountains. Now, to the east of the Carpathian Mountains, outside of my country, is Russia. And once you get to those mountains, then it's literally endless vistas of flat land, sometimes agricultural land, and that would pertain to the recently controversial let's see, what was the whole fight about? Ukraine, yeah, and others. So then outside of that, it just goes on and on and on for quite a while, until a long time period from there in your peregrinations, you come up against another mountain range, and these are the Ural Mountains. And the Ural Mountains divide continental Europe, continental Russia from Siberia. Behind it is really the cold country, really, Siberia. So that is, when we regard that, we can see that these are sort of natural divisions of the country. Now, all right, that geographically that should suffice at the present moment. But let's see, in other regard, it is important to remember that what you are dealing with in describing this, and it's practically indescribable. What you are seeing there is a absolutely vast territory. I mean, continental Russia plus Siberia, which is already regarded as outside of the continent, is about, I'm just guessing now, is about as large as the whole rest of Europe added together. So when you have these various reports about European Union and other configurations of people, not being particularly friendly of Russia, it's sort of like a flea sitting atop an elephant, because Russia is so much larger, and so much varied in population, so much varied in geography, so much varied in all kinds of things. it is an entire world by itself. Now the name whereby it is known, Rus, I have always tried to figure out precisely what Rus means, and the closest I have come is that it means something dark. And the darkness, I figured, had to do with the fact that all of continental Russia is based on agriculture and on a similar purveyance of commodities. And so it's the dark earth that produces the crops, mostly wheat, and much of that is actually in Ukraine and so forth. And for this reason, it was since ancient times, it was given the old Slavic name of Rus. Rus, the land of the dark earth. And of course, it's very much true, for instance, of the ancient province of Russia, not an independent country, but the ancient province of Russia that now is called Ukraine. In any event, let's say one needs to keep in mind that Rus is the land of the Slavs, which, because of its agricultural preoccupation and so forth, is dark, the black earth, the land of the black earth. And then as you get further back and approaching the Ural Mountains, well, it's still black, but there it's mostly grassland where the horses of the Cossacks were raised for centuries and so forth. But that appellation applies. Now you might wonder, especially if you speak another language besides of Russian, which I'm sure you do, as to how come that the land that is just to the north and northeast of Russia is called Prussia, P-R, or in German, Preußen. Well, because in the Middle Ages and thereafter, when all the Crusades were going on and so forth, then the German knights of the Germanic order had decided that their missionary territory is going to be to the east of them, and so they moved into some of the lands, some of the territories that were actually technically Russia. But since they have occupied them, and they named them Prussia, Preußen in German, and so that is how Prussia was separated from Russia and still is, and became the most powerful heartland of Germany. That's also interesting. Why is Prussia with a P while the rest of it is just Russia? Well, because they are both the same thing, but in two different pieces of territory. Now, coming from there, what was going on in this vast land of grass and little plots of agriculture and swampy lake territory, and which extended all the way to the Ural Mountains, and even had its own relatives in, let's say, in Siberia. What was going on there? Well, a diminutive, timid, not very ambitious populace was there of northern Slavs. And this populace consisted of people who were living there, but in frequent fear. Why? Because all kinds of other people from the south, from the east, would periodically cross the Russian plain, and in so doing, they probably were not very kindly to this native population. Again, I need to repeat what I have repeated other times, that the whole concept of native populations is very flawed, because there is no way of proving that any population was truly native to any place. We all came from somewhere, and we are all going somewhere. I would say the place that we are going is somewhere else, but in any event, this needs to be kept in mind. So these timid, diminutive little northern Slavs were there, and I must say, for the benefit of the Russian people, that they were maltreated and beaten up more in their history than probably anybody else. In came tribes of a rapacious nature from the east, Mongols, or Tartars as they were also called, all kinds of people, and they were not particularly kindly to the natives, if they are indeed natives, whom they found. So the clever Russians discovered a method which you might want to keep in mind, since there were many swamps in their big flat land on the other side of the Volga and so forth. They would find ways of jumping into the water and hiding underneath the water while taking in air through a reed. So they were the reed-breathing northern Slavs. And, you know, they weren't terribly courageous to come out and fight, because they knew that they're going to lose anyway. So the best thing is to hide until the enemy goes away, and then go back to your usual pursuits. So these are the people who lived there. And then something else happened. And I can't even tell you exactly when, but I would say probably somewhere as the time was moving sort of in the 700s, 800s AD toward the year 1000. And then in came some conquerors who were known as the Varangians. And the Varangians were a variety of Scandinavians. And they were led by their great hero, literally a deific figure, Rurik. And Rurik's descendants became the ruling class of Russia. In any event, now these new people came in, and they occupied the land, and they they used, for the most part, the native Slavs, northern Slavs, as a sort of serfs. Not exactly slaves, but serfs. And so an economy was instituted which was based on the cheap labor of the native Slavs and was commanded and organized by the Varangians. So the descendants of Rurik, the leader, the prince, became as I said, it was the leading people, the leading circle of Russia. And why was that so? Very simple, because they were smarter than anybody else. And you also keep that in mind. Oh, you know, these people come in and they create a new aristocracy and they take over all the land, and so how can they do that? Because they've got something in here. And it avails them more than the people who don't have that in here. And so then you can feel sorry for them if you desire, but you have to realize what is taking place. So that is pretty much what was taking place. And the tribes of the Varangians, led by their great leader Rurik, now took over as the new aristocracy of Russia. And believe it or not, that new aristocracy of Russia survived until it was exterminated by the Soviets after 1920 or so. They owned the land, and they employed the native Slavic population as their workers. And on the whole, they got along pretty well. So the word for muzhik, the word muzhik, which is now really the one of a peasant, is derived from what is the native Slavs called themselves. And then so gradually, it's a great big territory. I mean, you try to walk through it and you'll die on the way. But on the other hand, there are horses and there is this and that. So there was more and more circulation going on, especially by water. A landlocked country in a way, although when you go way down the south of Russia in the Crimea, you find the ocean. But you probably kill yourself walking or getting there first. In any event, the Russians were thus carrying on quite a fine economy, and it's kind of polarized in two parts of Russia. One was just on the eastern side of the Carpathian Mountains, and that is which now is often called the Ukraine, Ukraina in their language. And on the other hand, also another habitat, which much further back, and that became Muscovy. And they built a city there called Moscow, and that remained a very important city, as you can tell, right up to the present time. So these were the two points of life, and they were referred to as the Little Russia and the Big Russia. Little Rus is Ukraine, and Big Russia, the Big Russia is Moscow and its surrounding territories. So they were both they contained the ambitious and often, at least mildly educated populace, and were the sort of the two focal points of the vast Russian territories. Now, also, as time went on, what is called now Ukraine, that territory, Ukraine, was had more contact with the rest of Europe, and consequently was sort of more alive. There was more activity, there was more agriculture, there were more schools, all that sort of thing. And until they acquired a plague. And that plague was the periodic incursions into what is now called Ukraine of the Mongolians. And let me tell you, having those boys enter your cities and villages and so forth was no fun. Of course, they did not stay on the other side of the Ural Mountains, but they also went south of the Ural Mountains, which after about 900 AD was Hungary. So we had a tremendous Mongolian devastation in Hungary too, and they virtually killed off, I don't know, I would say probably 80-90% of the Hungarian people. When King Bela, I think it was King Bela IV, who had fled to Austria, just like some others, including myself, many centuries later, who had fled to, when he came back to his own country, he rode on horseback for something like 45 days before seeing a living soul. They were all killed off by the Mongols. Now, those were tough characters. There's no doubt about it. But of course we recovered in due course. We also had people coming in, immigrating and so forth, Saxon Germans from Germany and many other places. But let's say the Mongol intrusions into your country were no fun. So that being the case, Little Russia as it was called, which now recently has been called exclusively Ukraine, Little Rus was in difficult predicament because these incursions kept occurring about once a year, sometimes more often than once a year. Here they came on their little horses with their big whips, sort of Asian cowboys, yoo-hoo, hee-hee, ha-ha, and stealing all the agricultural products, raping all the women, killing a lot of the people, sometimes even killing the horses. And so they would come into a village, the Mongols, riding their little horses, get off their horses, and then they killed everybody and devastated the village beyond all belief. They didn't leave anything alive. Not a dog, not a cat, not a horse, not a mule. Everything was killed. And then they got on their little horses, and yoo-hoo, they rode off to devastate the next province. Really a nasty situation. But its long-term effects were that the people in Little Rus, now called Ukraine, were so diminished that they had no influence. They came more and more dependent on Big Rus, which was Moscow. Now then, nevertheless, they were closer to the rest of Europe, so they got more ideas, more books, various things that came in order to inform them, the people in Little Rus. And they became aware, for instance, of the fact that people in the rest of Europe, both south of them and north of them, were different religion. They were pagans. So that being the case, they went to the ruler of Little Rus, Vladimir the Great, who now is a saint of the Orthodox Church, Saint Vladimir, and asked him, Lord, if we remain pagans, then the Christians are just going to beat us up just like the Mongols do. So we have to find a good religion that will help us. So he said, all right. He picked out a bunch of the smarter people and sent them out. Now you go out in the 4 directions, east, west, north, south, and you figure out where they have the best religion for us. So they got and they went, and after a considerable time they came back and they said, Lord, I think we found it. He says, we went to the countries in Europe with their big, beautiful cathedrals, and we are early Middle Ages by now, and all of that. And then we turned south and we went down to the land of the Greeks, Byzantium. And he said, while we saw that in the rest of Europe, people prayed to God, but we found that in the Greek churches, God was present. He says he was there. And so we would recommend that you recommend in turn that the people of Little Rus should convert to the Greek Orthodox faith. And they did. And ever since then, the Russian lands, both Little Rus and Big Rus, that is Muscovy, have been of the Orthodox faith that they received from the Greeks and which they felt suited them very well and was very, very important. And Prince Vladimir of Little Rus, in turn, who had instigated that this whole conversion, was made a saint of the Orthodox Church and still is. Now there is something interesting there that might harken back to some of the matters that we concerned ourselves with the last few weeks, because the newly implanted Orthodox Church not only declared Prince Vladimir as a saint, but declared the entire country of the Orthodox faith, and did a great deal of reviving and civilizing of the country. the descendants of Prince and Saint Vladimir of Kiev, not Kiev, by the way, which reminds me of some kind of a culinary object. Kiev is something that you eat, but Kiev is an ancient city. So the Saint Vladimir of Kiev had, of course, a large family, and he enlarged the country and did a lot of good things for the country. And his family survived for centuries because they became known as the Princess Dolgoruki. And the Prince Dolgoruki at the time of the 19th century was the grandfather and the great-grandfather of Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. So she was a direct descendant of Saint Vladimir, the one who turned Russia to Christianity. At least you might say that there was something about these Dolgorukis in there that they like to create something religious. Whether it was Theosophy or whether it was Orthodox Church, they were right in the middle of it. However, there were still difficulties, and the difficulties were none other than our friends the Mongols, because they kept coming in. And the Ukrainians, or the people of Little Rus, had a hard time defending themselves. And so the interest, let us say, of the people, also the commercial interests, and many other facts of life had all shifted to where? To Muscovy, to Moscow, to Big Rus. And they remained there. So then and the Mongols kept on coming, kept on killing people, kept on killing the cattle, and in other ways discomforting the poor people. So what it developed into was that there was Big Rus, which was Moscow, back towards Siberia, and Little Rus, which is the present-day Ukraine, on this side of the Ural Mountains, and in trying to defend themselves against the Mongols. And that is how it remained actually until the present time. And that's why, let's say, the historical facts are that Little Rus, now called the Ukraine, remained little. Big Rus, Muscovy, became big. And there wasn't any conscious oppression on the Muscovites, but it was just that they were left alone by the Mongols, while the rest of the land was not. So now developments went on. The Byzantine Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, decided to send out priests and bishops to Muscovy, and so they did. And as time went on, the chief of the Russian, by then Russian Orthodox Church, residing in Moscow, had been elected, and the Greek patriarch, his all holiness, the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople, who is still there. I used to read, or at least I did read some of his letters, of the present one, or the one a few years ago, because the letters were addressed to Manly Palmer Hall. And you know what his all holiness was writing about? He was writing about the fact that Manly Hall knew as much of Orthodox theology as he needed, and that he was a very wise man, and the Patriarch was interviewing Manly Hall in letters about what? He was interviewing him about astrology. And so I saw all of these things in a beautiful handwriting, probably written by a secretary. This was the Patriarch Athenagoras of Constantinople, who reigned for a long time, and who previously had been an Greek Orthodox Archbishop in the United States. So he wrote real good English, and Mr. Hall had really a big time with his writings. Oh, I have the Patriarch writing to me. He would come out of his office and he'd be carrying some of this. He says, look. And the Patriarch wrote in English. Why? Because he lived here before. So in any event, that was a significant development. And this Patriarch, as you know, the Greek Orthodox clergy generally, unlike the Roman Catholic clergy from a certain time on, not always, a certain time on, they marry and have children. So it was with the Patriarch, the national Patriarch in Moscow. And the national Patriarch had a son. And the son, I don't know whether he became a priest or not, but he certainly was married, and he was the beginning of the illustrious dynasty of Romanov, which remained on the throne of the Tsars until the coming of the red tide in the early 20th century. I think his name was Alexis Romanov. So, and this created a friction too, up to this time, because now the Ukrainians again wanted their own patriarch. Why couldn't we have? So these are national patriarchs that are all theoretically under the ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople. So, however, the way it worked out, the Patriarch of Kiev had a metropolitan before that, which is like Archbishop. Kiev never received its own legitimate Patriarch, but Moscow still does, even though they had been ruled by the Soviets for such a long time. But let's say, even in the ecclesiastical jurisdictions, there came about a schism within the Russian Empire. But especially once the son of the Patriarch, whose name was Alexis Romanov, became the Patriarch of Moscow. Then the Patriarchate remained in Moscow, and that remained the center of the Russian Orthodox Church. Now, I don't want to mislead you, because you'd find it in any book of history. Later on, a couple of hundred years later, there was a little glitch. And the glitch was that the Patriarchate of Moscow continued to arrogate unto itself all the ecclesiastical power, and subsequently, another 100 years or so later, when I tell you this old age, but the Tsar of Russia by then became a very great and very famous Tsar who was known as Peter the Great. And Peter the Great had difficulties with having somebody else occupying to some extent his position. So he did away with the Patriarchate. And not until the Soviet regime was the Patriarchate of Moscow restored, because Stalin wanted a servile, cringing patriarch, first Tikhon and then Sergius, and so that is when the Patriarchate was restored. All that long time from Peter the Great until World War I, the ruling body of the Russian Orthodox Church was what was called the Holy Synod. And the Holy Synod was like one particular incident that was told to me, somebody who was very good on Russian history, so that the Tsar, I think that was probably, sounded like a tough Tsar, like Nicholas I or so, who was known as the Iron Tsar. You didn't fool with him, but he goes out and reviews a body of soldiers, and so ask, who is your commanding officer? Well, Colonel Shuharov, your Majesty. Yes, he says, you hold a very good group of soldiers, you know how to keep them in order. You know what, I hereby appoint you as the president of the Holy Synod. And so he becomes the head of the Synod, commanding all the Orthodox bishops, because he kept the soldiers in good order. Not a bad idea. But of course later on that changed again. Now then, this is all history, and it may or may not be of great interest to you. But I will try to more or less conclude on the note which made me bring this up, because it is the fact that from the very beginning, from the beginning of the Russian nation, whether it is the Little Rus or Big Rus or any of them, from the beginning of the Russian nation, the Russian nation was intensely and with a very, very strong and indelible dedication was devoted to the Orthodox Church. And when after the many years of suppression, really terrible oppression of the Orthodox Church during the secret regime. All it took was one wind to blow the red rag from above the Kremlin away, by which I mean the Soviet flag. One of those. Immediately the bells started ringing, the priest started coming out, and the present president of the Federal Republic of Russia, Vladimir Putin, had himself baptized and goes out so that everybody can see him every Sunday to his favorite church near the Kremlin. And the tales that I hear from my friend who goes to St. Petersburg all the time from Turkey to visit his wife, because they will countenance that. But they are not so sure that they want a foreigner living in St. Petersburg, so they have never given him complete permission. You know, the proclivity of the Russians for state bureaucracy, while it is no longer under the hammer and sickle and the red star, is still there. They are very tough. But you know what the present time? Oh, I've got news for you. Not only news, but happy news. If you, from America, or any people from Europe, from the European Union, had enough of what's going on here, or what's going on in Europe, and they want to move to Russia because they can't stand the confusion, the anarchy, the lack of religion in Western Europe or in the United States, they are welcome to come to Russia. Can you see what an immense difference? What an immense difference. But I can see it, I can understand it. On the big holidays, my friend tells me on the telephone, because that's how we communicate, tells me that the streets are filled with people in St. Petersburg, because that's where he lives when he goes to Russia. Everywhere there are thousands, and I don't know, so one of the last Easter, I think there were something like 150,000 people walking in the streets of St. Petersburg, which reminds me somewhat of the people walking in the streets of Budapest when I was still there in 1947 or so forth. Why? Because they had a leader, Cardinal Vincenti, and they had some people they wanted to get away from, the people with the red star and the red flag. But meanwhile, there were all those many years of oppression, of Gulag Archipelago, of the Lubyanka prison and all of that. But you know what? God has returned. It's very difficult to exile God. And if you look into world history, every once in a while you find a ruler, you know. It's often referred to as Caesar papism, you know, because, and you know that the word Tsar originates in the word Caesar. So does the German Kaiser, because Caesar's figure became the example of the emperor, and remained the Byzantine emperor was called Caesar, the Western Roman emperor, and then later on the Holy Roman Emperor in Vienna. They were all called Kaiser or Caesar. In any event, it is the upwelling of the population within the context of the Holy Russian Orthodox Church is monumental, and so is, you might say, the sorrow and the sadness over how the Tsar and his family were murdered. In August sometimes is the anniversary of the execution of Tsar Nicholas II and the Tsaritsa Alexandra, Tsarevich Alexei, and their 5 daughters, who were all killed in Siberia by the Soviets. But now you can't count the people on the streets. They're marching with banners. They have the pictures of the murdered family of the Tsar that they are carrying, and they're ringing the bells and says, Nicholas, Nicholas and Alexandra, pray for us in heaven where you are. And I must confess that I heed their exclamation. Some years, just to kind of conclude this a little bit, some years ago I rode in a bus, I am sorry to say, all the way from O'Hare Airport in Chicago to a location in Wisconsin. It was a Theosophical convention held in Wisconsin, and my compadre on the bus was a very wonderful Theosophical lady who is no longer with us either, who had just a couple of weeks ago returned. Her husband was dead already. She had returned from a trip to Russia. And she said, well, how did you? Oh, he says, you have no idea. He says, I walked in St. Petersburg on the street, and I looked up at the old buildings, and I had a distinct impression that they all wanted to come back and be themselves again. And the church is the same thing. The Soviet era is over, and God is back. And so it is. Let me tell you, I am extremely happy about it, because it shows the way to others, shows the way to people in my country where they first came and tried to extinguish our religion, and they will show it elsewhere. Because it's time for us to remember in the West that if you try to be a God killer, your task is going to be too big for you. And you know, the Soviets had an organization, the Bezbožnik in organization, it is called in Russian. And that means literally the God killers. And when the Soviets took over, they took over a magnificent building which was built as the cathedral of the miraculous Madonna of Kazan, one of the miraculous Madonnas, and they took that over in Moscow, and they made out of it the office of the anti-God movement. Well, I'm happy to tell you who won the battle. I'm happy to tell you who won the battle, there and elsewhere. And so it's a different world there. I haven't been there, and I doubt it that I will go there, even though about a couple of 100 years back, I have Russian relatives, who of course all were exterminated by the Soviets, but with those connections I think I would get by. But it's a little bit too late in the day. But the fact of the matter is that old Russia, holy Russia, the true Russia is returning, and returning in a big way. And whatever the geopolitical difficulties may be, that has nothing to do with it. Religion is back, honesty is back, and that is all that matters. Because, and I may return to that on another occasion, it is interesting to keep in mind, but I cannot go into that too much more, that Russia has a certain potential, a potential that might even be conducive to the revival of spirituality in the West. And maybe that strange process has started already 100 years before, in 1875, by way of the little Russian girl who wrote to her great-grandfather, "I have found it, I have discovered it, I have discovered the alchemy, how people can join the divine ones, how they can become like the angels. Listen to me, great-grandfather," and I think he did. So she started something fabulous. By the way, just to indicate to you, in case somebody ever says otherwise, I have seen the printed letter in the bound volumes of Blavatsky's collected writings, where she says that if any one of our society becomes a communist, he should be excluded right away. Already then, this is 1870s or even earlier, she was tremendously grief-stricken when Tsar Alexander II was murdered by the what did they call themselves at that time? Anarchists. And wrote very tearful letters to her cousins in Russia and so forth. Don't let anybody tell you that Blavatsky was on that side, in no ways. And not only that, but now Russia is turning also. And, all the, well, I can come back to it later, but let's say the present situations in Russia. There is somebody, I just got to tell you that one. There is somebody named Alexander Dugin. Yes, Dugin. Who is called the philosopher of Putin. Has a great big beard like a Rasputin, or something like that. And Alexander Dugin, I have seen some of his books. Some of his books are translated into English already. He quotes Blavatsky. He keeps mentioning Blavatsky. And he even mentions Edward Aleister Crowley, which people around here are afraid to mention. I am not, but there have been times when I had to kind of cool it a little bit on old Al. But let's say, there are things going on there. So who knows? But the fact of the matter is that things are moving in a spiritual direction. And they are moving in a spiritual direction both through the Russian Orthodox Church and in other ways. And I think along these lines we can look for a real rebirth, a real revival of Russia along spiritual lines. where is our revival coming from, folks? Where is it coming from? Or is it coming at all? Maybe we ought to give some thought to that. Because there or here or on Mars or anywhere, when there is a connection with the, how did Jung call it, the supreme power? Whatever it is, yeah. The supreme power, there is a restoration of the relationship of the human and the divine, then everything will go in a good way. Without that, nothing is going to go in a good way. And when I die, I put a little stone on my, where my ashes are and say, in addition to everything else, he was also a prophet. So, whatever that means. In any event, I think I gave you a good little rundown. But of course there is much involved. There is psychology involved. There is the melancholy and yet at the same time so tremendously devout keynote of the Russian soul, which is probably, it doesn't have to be. I mean, there are innumerable hymns and songs, but it doesn't even have to concern that. But you can tell that a sort of that melancholy and devout soul. So I'm a very bad singer, but I will attempt to sing to you, probably to my great disgrace, the most popular song in Russia. It was the most popular song when I was with the Russian soldiers in Hungary and later on, the Volga song. Volga, Volga, Matrudnaya, Volga, Ruskaya rieka, nevidori trepudarka, Todomskaysko kazaka. And that's as much as I remember of it. But you can see that there's this strange melancholy devotion. And of course the words say, it is even sung to the Volga. So Volga, Volga, Matrona, Volga, Volga, our old mother. Volga, 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 Ruskaya rieka, Volga, thou who art the real Russian river. Nevidori tepodarka, thou wilt not get any present today from the Cossacks. Nevidori tepodarka, the Donskaya of the Don Cossacks, because I could tell you how to tell a Don Cossack from a Kuban Cossack from the others, because they, when available, they wear this round fur encrusted hat, and on the top of it there is a collar with a cross. And the Kuban Cossack have a red collar on top. And the Volga Cossack at least did a few years ago, had a blue cover on top. And you can tell by them. And of course they were originally the cavalry that was adopted by the Tsar, but they are really a whole nationality of their own. Kazakh. There is still a Kazakhstan, the place of the Cossacks. That's where the Cossacks originally come from. But otherwise I will bore you and you will never come back, so I am not going to say any more. But maybe you have gotten a little impression of an incredible place. An incredible place with incredible people that is coming back into an incredible position watch my word, whether any of us are here or not, there is a holy Russia being reborn that may act as the one of the salvational elements of the West. It may. Then again, it may not. Okay. When you try to predict the future, it's as who was that sports figure?
Yogi Berra.
Yogi Berra. Then you cannot be sure. You cannot be sure. You cannot be sure to predict the future. But maybe in this case we have an intimation of the future. And if it is one, it's a good one, finally, really a good one. And you know, many of you know me or know some of my background. I have seen my relatives lying in their blood on the floor, shot by the Soviet soldiers. I have seen the people taken away to the Gulag, even as a few years before they were taken away by Hitler to Auschwitz. And I tell you, there is no difference. There is no difference. It is all the demon's work. And as such, it cannot last. It cannot last. It has not lasted. It will not last. Thank you.